Namaste, good evening everyone. Thank you very much for attending this session quite late in the day, but it's a bit gloomy as well. It's my absolute pleasure to be on a panel with these three colourful and distinguished people. I have to confess that when Ajit said, "Oh, your session is called Writing in the Age of Populism," I had the oppressive feeling of being engulfed by an octopus, because what is writing? I mean, are we talking journalism? Are we talking my social media posts? Are we talking fiction? Are we talking what? And we had a bit of back and forth, and I think what's interesting to think about to kick the conversation off, if it's okay with all of you, is to say not what is writing, but what is populism, because we all think we have the same understanding of it depending on our political and ideological point of view, but it plays out in very different ways in very different contexts. So since Jeremy is here from the UK and they've had the most recent display of populism, pro-popular vote, I thought maybe you could start off.
Well, I first of all want to say thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. It's magnificent, and thank you so much. Now, if I'm going to talk about populism, it's very important to also bring into the mix the question of fascism, because the two things are very closely interrelated. Theories of populism that I've been reading tend to try to separate the two and suggest that populism is something which begins roughly after the Second World War in 1945. I'm not sure I agree with that, but it needs me to distinguish between fascism, populism, and something else which interests me a lot, and that is the question of the charismatic leader. If you want the charismatic leader, the very best thing to read on that is Marx. Marx talks about the charismatic leader in his essay called The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, written in 1852 after Louis Bonaparte had forced his way in a coup d'etat into the position of becoming the Emperor of France. That was in 1852, and Marx writes about it, and he begins with this wonderful statement from Hegel that the great events of world history occur, so to speak, twice, the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. And if I want to think about tragedy and farce, at the moment, Britain is complete farce. And that's all I'm going to say about the British general election of last Thursday, except to say I don't want to go back to the UK at the moment. Marx writes about the charismatic leader. The word charismatic comes from Max Weber, writing about 1915, and Max Weber talks about the charismatic leader, the leader who rules not by appealing to custom, not by appealing to law, but by appealing to his own magnetic personality. So that's one very important part of the mix. We've got this idea of the charismatic leader, the leader who controls and who has the people in his pocket or her pocket, but it's usually a he. That's one aspect I want to think about. The second is fascism, and I want very quickly to say about fascism that I define it in two ways. First of all, it's a neurotic fear of the other. I'll repeat that, a neurotic fear of the other. And second, it's a kind of nostalgia for a lost power. In other words, the fascist feels that things were better in the past and that power has slipped away and power needs to be re-grasped and re-held. So think about this as a neurotic fear of the other, first. Second, a feeling that power has slipped away. And so it brings in nostalgia, and in my view, nostalgia always tends towards fascism. In the same way as I think sentimentalism always tends towards fascism. It's closely linked to the idea we've lost our status, we had it, and it's gone. Now, populism. Now, this is the topic I want to speak, as I'm supposed to speak about most. What is populism? Populism emerges in the years after the war, when it's no longer possible to be openly fascist. It emerges as an appeal to the people. Now, I want you to note the singularity of that word. It's the people. It's not the peoples. In other words, populism is anti. It's anti any sense of diversity. It's anti any sense that people divide by religion, by class, by sexuality, by race, or in any other way that you can think. It's a refusal to acknowledge that other people may be different from you. Populism always appeals to the people, and it always talks about the people as though the people were a singular entity. You always hear American presidents talk about the American people. It should be peoples. The British electorate had a referendum on Brexit, leaving the EU, the European Union, 3 years ago, and ever since then, politicians have been talking about we must respect the will of the people. Now, this assumes that the people is a unitary single factor, and it needs to be emphasized that the danger of populism is that address to the people as an imagined entity which has no diversity inside it. For that reason, we can say that populism puts the people as an imagined singular community against what it calls the liberal elite. And the word elite here is very serious indeed. In the Brexit campaign, which was held in 2016, one politician who particularly gets up my nose, Michael Gove, one politician was heard to say very loudly and very emphatically, "We've had enough of experts. We've had enough of experts." Well, nobody who believes in education, nobody who believes that it's necessary to learn anything could ever say that. It's even more shameful that Gove, who did say it, had been for many years the Minister of Education in the Conservative government. If you say we've had enough of experts, what you're doing is you're putting...
So, and I've dealt with this with editors before. I've had short stories where, because I don't like to explain, cultural concepts. I don't like to detract a story. The telling of the story, the plot, the characterization, in order to sort of become, an anthropologist, in order to explain every single aspect of Afghan culture or Islamic culture, and so I'll just tell the story as I think it should be told. And I've come into contact with editors who are like, well, could you explain what this means, and could you go into this a little bit more, or could we translate this term in order to appeal to this common reader, and so it just made me think, that I and my editor had very different ideas about who exactly our reader was, right? When I'm writing, oftentimes I'm writing to, my family, or I'm writing to, my friends. I'm writing to an Afghan American community, and I think because I allow myself to write toward people that I love, people that I grew up with, a community that I live within, I think it allows me to speak in a voice that's very different than a lot of perhaps than a lot of what's being read these days, and so at times that has sort of led to conflicts with this idea of the common reader that needs to be appeased, which within the context of the United States tends to actually just be a white reader, and so it's just something that I've had to deal with, and I've led to some tension between editors and I.
And Harish, you come from a journalism background, and you obviously come from a very big country with a different kind of populism. So what does populism mean in your context? Like, what would you as a writer be responding to if you wanted to sort of address populism or explain it?
Mine is somewhat exactly as Jervis said about populism, since he's defined that entirely clearly for all of us. And you spoke as being kind of buttonholed into a community, and then how your editors and publishers want you to explain it and flatten it out so that everybody can. I mean, you convert everything into pap, basically, so that you have more readers to buy it or understand it. This fear of complications is another aspect of lack of diversity as populism rises. And in my case, for example, I know around 4 languages. I can read 4 languages, and I've never stayed in the state where I belong, from where my mother tongue is. I mean, I'm technically from Kerala, but I've lived in Gujarat or Bombay or Delhi. So in many ways, it's just as one gets buttonholed in each part of my country, which speaks different languages. But one does want to write something. When you're writing something, you want to write something that is more universal, which cuts across just the fact that my experience alone is not in itself a kind of universal thing. In the sense, you have to universalize it. I was talking to my panelists yesterday, and I kind of liked a particular aspect. I dug up the speech Milan Kundera gave at the when he went to accept the Jerusalem Prize, and I thought that kind of explains very clearly what we're talking about now. And he got the prize in 1985, and he says, and he's talking about the novel. He says, "I come here to receive this prize as a novelist, not a writer." And this is what he says: the novel is the imaginary paradise of individualists. That's point number 1. Second, a territory where nobody possesses the truth. And the third is that it's a country where everyone has a right to be under doubt. Now that exactly would be more or less your notion of a democratic or equal nation. I mean, whether it's Nepal or India or America or Britain. So to my mind, that is where I would imagine writing should take us to. As in, the integral writer should not be looking for audiences or look for the maximum amount of buyers, because that is what we call genre writing. I mean, that may not be exactly what you call high literature. Would that be correct? I mean, what do you say? I mean, your definition of populism and fascism is another aspect which caught my attention, because my country too, like Brazil or Britain or America, is going through what we call the populist upsurge. We now have Brazil, for another country from the emerging markets in the slot. What it does is, like you said, you said they kind of creates the other, and then claims to speak for the original self. That is what I think my country, it's happened. As in, we have converted, we are kind of converting all Hindus of various parts into a kind of a calendar art version of Hinduism, and a kind of it doesn't kind of it kind of cuts out the various diversities within that huge subcontinent. So that is what is happening, a kind of a stupefying simplification of everything.
Thank you. There's a lot to pick through here. Some of the things that I would like to come back to with all of you at some point is this idea about nostalgia that you talked about. On the one hand, I think we understood what you were saying as being nostalgia is always invented, right? And it's ideological. It can be extremely ideological and can be used to political ends. But there is also the nostalgia of the genuinely dispossessed, of people who are genuinely dispossessed or people who've lost a lot. So it can be used in different ways. And I think, Jamil Jan, maybe we start with you because your book it's not terribly nostalgic, but maybe you were trying to capture something of a certain moment in time. So there's both that you're writing for an Afghan audience, an Afghan-American audience, but also for an American audience in that you're challenging their own nostalgia about their war, right? So if you could...
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think certainly nostalgia was actually probably one of the primary motivational factors that went into me writing the novel, even besides the historical and the political elements in the novel. It was sort of essentially a personal task. I was always sort of haunted by these memories of my childhood in Logar, and these days of my youth that I spent with my cousins in this beautiful, but war-torn land. And so going into the writing of the story, going into the writing of the novel, I think nostalgia was sort of a main propelling factor, and I think one of the central goals of the telling of this tale and of all the other tales within the novel was an act of remembering and of bringing back into the American consciousness this long history of warfare and this long history of violence that continues to this day, and that has been sort of forced upon the Afghan people, and especially the people in Logar. And so, I think you bring up a good point that there's different ways that nostalgia, I think, can be used by different people within different contexts.
I'd rather say myself that nostalgia is always thinking about something which never happened. I think there's a big distinction to be made between memory and nostalgia. Nostalgia, for me, is an invention of the 1950s. It's a wish for a state of affairs which never, ever happened. Memory has to do with trying to recall injustice, of course, trying to appease what has happened, and trying to hold some kind of coherence. And I think they're light years away from each other, that we should not remember. We should. But I would want to say that two things characterize our modernity. One is the inability to remember, and the substitution for remembrance of all sorts of pseudo forms of memory, as in the souvenir, and the loss of memory means the creation of a kind of fake memory, which is what I would call nostalgia.
Yeah, thank you for that corrective. I think that was exactly what I was trying to get at.
As Kundera said, the struggle of memory against forgetting. The novel is the struggle of memory against forgetting.
Yeah, I think but we don't need to go there. But I wanted to pick up on something you said. You talked about writing about something that is, do you write about something that's my experience alone? And I think this is a question that it's really useful to tease apart, because when you talk about populism, you talk about the common reader, the common man, the voter, as if it's a homogeneous thing. At the same time, the other end of the spectrum, especially in more sort of literary and artistic circles, is that you can only write about yourself and you have no authority and no ability to write about anyone else. You've got no right to. Do you think, that's a slight caricature, but where do you think that tension can be exploited usefully to bring up a diversity and multiplicity of stories, but also then to say, okay, there are some people who can represent their own experiences better than others?
I'm a bit of a quote freak, so there's a Gore Vidal line which says, "Don't write what you know." That is for people who should not write at all. It's a kind of opposite of the dictum in writing circles and communities, which is you should always write what you know about, not about things that you do not know about. So there again is a fight between ambition versus what you seek to do at one level. But what you mentioned about sounded more to me like what we call the woke generation. There is a difference between being woke and being awake or being a little more detailed. I mean, like you said about how every experience seems very important and dear and vital to you. At some point, you need to kind of pickle that experience till you're able to draw the right kind of flavor from it. Because, as Sartre said, there are only experience in life. Once it's over, it becomes adventure. So between the adventurous exposition of your own experience versus how you universalize it, for the lack of any bigger, better word than that, would be what I would imagine the goal of writing should be.
I think the response to that is, okay, boomer. But I will let you do it.
I mean, that's certainly, a topic that I think about a great deal, especially, in regards to my own writing. When I was going into this idea of writing this novel set in Afghanistan, it did, I had a great deal of anxiety about that. I was, I questioned my own resolve to write it. I questioned my own ability to write it. I think there was always sort of this, this doubt regarding the authenticity of my writing, the authenticity of my experience, and it was just something that I was very conscious of in the writing of my novel, of whether I had the right to tell this story, of whether I had the ability to tell this story, and even now as I finish the novel and as I'm working on more stories, it's just something that I keep continuing to think about, and I. Yeah, I don't know. That's all I gotta say. I'm sorry.
I think this is an incredibly difficult and interesting topic. We vowed before we came on the platform we would not talk about fake news, because fake news is going to be talked about tomorrow, and I'm sure it'll be very interesting. So I'll just say fake emotion instead. And say that perhaps at the heart of populism, as at the heart of fascism, and for me there's only a kind of gradation between the two. At the heart of populism is a kind of appeal to a fake emotion. You feel like this, I feel like this. The clever people who are governing us do not feel like this. Fake emotion, fake memory, which I call nostalgia, and a kind of fake experience. One of the things about modernity, here I'm quoting the great cultural critic Walter Benjamin, who killed himself in 1940 rather than be killed by the Nazis at Auschwitz. One of the things that Walter Benjamin talks about is the poverty of experience in modernity. We have our experiences given to us by the media. We have our experiences given to us in so many ways that we, as it were, we think we have the experience, but we don't. in literary circles, people are always talking about affect theory, the question of feeling and affect. Well, personally, I don't believe in affect theory. I believe, because I'm interested in psychoanalysis, I believe in desire. And I believe that desire is marked by lack. In other words, it's people are yearning for an experience which is deprived for them in some of the conditions of modernity. And that is exactly where populism thrives. It's trying to work up emotions and trying to work up experiences in people who have been deprived of them. That's the tragedy of it. Now, one of the fascinating things about novel writing is the cultural critic Georg Lukács talks about the novel as being the epic of homelessness. The people who write novels are people who feel homeless, and I would say that's a marvelous description of your own book. Homelessness is a kind of condition, a kind of exile, right? The Danish philosopher Kierkegaard had this wonderful expression talking about Christianity. He said, who could possibly go to church in Copenhagen where he lived? Who could possibly go to church when you see the people who do go to church? You see? Just look at the people who go to church. You couldn't possibly go. You might be a Christian, but being a Christian would show itself in not going to church. Right? And in that sense, you can see that homelessness separates itself from the people who are appealed to in populism. Homelessness sets itself against that imagined community, which is, as has been said, white, often rural, or thinks itself as rural, male, dispossessed of power, thinking that women are taking over, thinking that minorities are taking over, thinking that in my country that black people are taking over or Muslims are taking over, all these sorts of nasty, all this kind of nasty speech which has given us Brexit, because believe me, Brexit has got very little to do with Europe, but everything to do with playing the race card and disliking the idea of people who think and speak differently from you. Now, my point is this, now I wind up, is that the novel sets itself against those people. Your homelessness in relationship to that kind of imagined community.
Thank you. I was wondering if we could turn that into sort of a slightly more practical question, because I do come from a policy background, so I just want policy stuff. But in response to that, if that is what a novel does, and if we are in this moment of our various social, political, economic schisms and contradictions that are coming to a boil, what is the job of a writer, and those of you...
But from the Muslim Algerian perspective, I also like the fact that he seems to be writing it in exactly the Camus short sentences, very terse prose, which is fascinating and very beguiling too. Similarly, I read Patrick Chauvesu, who's a writer from Martinique, which is a Caribbean island. And he's explored the history of African slaves without any history as we know it, as in non-documented. He kind of populates that book with amazing, what shall we say, mix of heard stories as remembered by generations, then also a notion of how the body of the slave reacts to, let's say, how he plants his foot on the ground, how the ground responds to him, as opposed to what we will not hear that kind of stories, or how the tree responds to him when he's running away from a particular plantation. I thought that was an extraordinary book which kind of got back or won back the black slaves' history to himself. for himself and his community.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of this idea of what a writer is supposed to do, or what a writer's job is, I mean, I think it's an incredibly difficult question, especially you know, from my own personal experience. I think this idea that the novel is an act of remembering, I think it's an idea that speaks very true to me. I think this idea that a novel should also be somehow an act of subversion as well is incredibly important, because I mean, there are certain ways now you are sort of seeing a trend now in contemporary literature of resistance to the status quo, of resistance to this typical historical canon, and what's happening now is that fortunately, you know, a lot of voices that have never been heard, a lot of histories that have never been told, are for the first time being allowed to receive some sort of like an audience, a national audience, and even sometimes an international audience. One thing that I think of in regards to my own work, something that I keep as the novel that I sort of write in the shadow of, has always been 100 Years of Solitude. And one of the most remarkable things about 100 Years of Solitude, the novel by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, is it's sort of a retelling of Colombia's entire national history, from pre-colonial times up until around the 1970s or so. And one thing that he did was that in that novel, he retold this historical massacre that occurred in Colombia, where 3,000 workers were gunned down by government forces, and for years and years and years, decades, the official historiographical record of that massacre was that maybe 10 people died, and they ended up putting the entire blame on the workers themselves because they rose up and they were fighting up against the policemen, whereas the oral history, the history of the peoples themselves, had always said that it was an incredible, horrific massacre, that there was trains of just dead bodies that left this town. And what ended up happening is that in Marquez's retelling of that story, that has now become sort of the official story. That's actually become, because of the popularity of his novel, that's now understood to be sort of the official history of what happened. And so what Marquez ended up doing with this novel and with this story is that, you know, he created a complete resurgence of this historical event. He almost brought this, you know, this entire tragedy back to life, back to national consciousness, and that's always sort of been for me, you know, the like sort of a final endeavor, I think.
I think that the Marquez illustration is very powerful about the whole idea of counter memory and counter memory as against the official version, and it's this way in which the official version again feeds nostalgia and feeds national identity. I mean, that seems to me to be absolutely at the heart of it. And of course, the wonderful thing about Marquez, if I could just add to that, is that he is one of those writers who bucks the trend. He does not write for the common reader. He creates a readership. The whole, we could say that he is, in some ways, redefined the course of the novel in the last 30 or 40 years. And it's because he has the courage to write in such a way that he generates a readership who will read him. And in that sense, one of the terrible things about populism is it denies a future. Writers have got to be adventurous because they've got to create a future. And to create a future seems to me to be the most important political thing we can do.
Thank you. That was a fantastic sort of final point for now. I want to see if anyone has questions in the audience. We are... उता पछाडि एउटा छ, दुईटा छ है, प्लिज. questions? Very hard to tell in, please. If anyone has questions. No.
My question is directed towards all the three panelists. In your respective writing careers, have you ever faced any kind of personal threat for writing against the current, against the prevailing dogma? If you have, how have you dealt with such threats? Thank you.
The theme is writing in the age of populism. So I come with the standpoint that populism is a side effect of the technological flux that we are experiencing. So I would like to ask you as a question as writers. You don't have to validate my point or disagree with it in particular, but I believe that the future of writing is almost over, writers as thematically, if you don't see ourselves as storytellers, will be extinct because we have to communicate ideas and stories. So how does that change the way we see ourselves as writers? And how do we think that the thought process has to adapt? That's my question to anyone can respond.
Let's take one last question here.
My question is, you can answer, any three of you can answer it. First of all, I totally disagree with you, Mr. Gentleman. The future of the book is over. I don't think so. But it has changed a little bit because of social media and Twitter and Facebook and everything. Our trend has become more we want to know more, is it real or is it fiction? So we are drawn towards more into memoirs. So these days, all the bestsellers books are more than novel. It's the memoirs which is selling. It's New York #1 selling point. It has become like that. So in this age of superstar memoir and memoirist, there is another trend, mixing fiction and memoir together. It's autofiction. And Elena Ferrante and Ov knows, it's very difficult to, Norwegian writer, I think Ov Nosgaard is a Norwegian writer. So because of their fame and their book, it is also proved that, autofiction has become very, very fashionable and it is very hot selling. So what do you think? Do you feel compulsion that at this age, which is selling right now, autofiction, you have to write it, or do you stick to your own jiddiness, that no, I will write my own genre, not autofiction, just because it sells?
Thank you. Stubbornness, exactly. 2 minutes each, if you don't mind. Yep.
The question about autobiography and autofiction, for me, I think, for me, it's a non-issue because I think that all writing changes the past. It has that ability. It recreates the past. It doesn't just record the past. In recording it, it shapes it. And in that way, it becomes impossible to make a distinction between fact and fiction. I think the important point about autobiography, if I could use that term rather than autofiction, in fact, the important point about autobiography there is it's the writing of the self by writing, and it's the emphasis on writing which, as it were, is transformative. And anyone who does write knows how true that is, that you write something and you go back to it and you don't know what you don't know what the sentence is saying. It's saying something other from what you imagined it to be saying. And it's that discovery of a kind of plurality in the text, which is, for me, a mirror of how society is. It's not one thing, it's many things, and it's changing all the time.
In regard to what you mentioned about reality versus, what shall you say, a kind of unreality, you should realize it's not like the gentleman said, a function of technology alone. Because very often, lots of good writers, I mean, Marquez, you already mentioned, Salman Rushdie wrote Midnight Children, which is about Indian history, as in conventional Indian history, but after independence, post-independence, so 47 to now. Similarly, Gunter Grass wrote The Tin Drum, which is again full of peculiar, I mean, there's the main character is a boy who refuses to grow up. And he experiences all of 1930s Germany as this willful kind of dwarf. And he joins Hitler's gang, and then how his story, through his story, he manages to, like he said, reclaim Germany's true history during the most difficult years, which has been, of course, very impactful across the globe. I mean, not only in Europe or Germany, the rise of Hitlerism. So this business of reality versus unreality angle might be just a nascent part of growing up. Eventually, we can probably easily figure out the difference. I do not think anybody would doubt that Oscar is a device to tell a story. You know, I mean, it's difficult to believe, or any of the, like Marquez often uses that too. This magic realism, for example. Again, the idea of the magic is making sure the realism kind of reaches you more correctly, as opposed to the official version of it.
Yeah, and I'll go back to the first question. You know, fortunately, I haven't received any, which I believe was about threats, correct? So I mean, fortunately, I haven't received any direct threats, but certainly there has been resistance to my writing. You know, when I did my first interview with NPR, and I was discussing, you know, the condition in Afghanistan, the state of the war, the violence there. I did sort of have my first, social media backlash, and people were telling me, you know, if you hate America so much, why don't you go back to your country? And this sort of a rhetoric there, you know, and there's also been sort of pushback against elements of my own novel, the bilingualism in it, the historical elements, the political elements, and it's been interesting, you know. I've read these sorts of things, and it's been fascinating for me to see the way that that these audiences, right, this audience that would actually maybe perhaps be defined in populist terms as the common man, as the common reader, has actually been incredibly resistant to my writing, specifically because of the ways that I'm trying to, you know, invoke remembrance, or invoke pluralism, or invoke a sense of like multiple identities, invoke a sense of diversity, and that is sort of exactly what is causing them to be frightened or to resist this sense of moving toward, you know, a new voice, or as Jeremy said, a new future.
Thank you. I don't think we have time for any more questions. I'll just note that all three of these otherwise stellar, upright people sidestep the question of their own impending obsolescence. Apparently, but you wouldn't address it. So, the AI.
One of the questions suggested that writing is a thing of the past and it's going to be replaced, which I suspect is somebody, some educator, entrepreneur also said that the education, nobody goes to schools for education anymore. You can get every information on the Google, but it's like a T.S. Eliot's line, you know, I mean, where is the wisdom lost in knowledge, and where is the knowledge lost in information? I suspect we'll all arrive at that stage at some point.
Anyway.
What didn't I address?
I'll explain it later. But this has been a great session, and for anyone who was trying to take notes about reading recommendations, in addition to the Garcia Marquez and the Salman Rushdie, there was Kamal Daoud's The Mercer Investigation, Patrick Chamoisu's Texaco, I think. Slave Woman. And on nostalgia, if anyone wants to read Svetlana Boym, it goes exactly down the road Jeremy was going. Thank you all very much.